start by giving you a very brief introduction to mammals and some of the terminology that I'm going to be using. And actually, I've put some of the terminology over here on the blackboard, or the whiteboard as you might call it, so that you can follow along with those things relatively easily. What I've put on here, first of all, that's a cheetah, and it's supposed to remind me to tell you that the mammals are animals that have hair, and they also feed their young with mammary glands. In other words, the mothers make milk that the babies drink. So those are two ways that you can identify a mammal in today's world. Now, there are three kinds of mammals, sort of basic kinds of mammals, and those are listed on the board there. There are the eutherian or placental mammals, and this is represented in this slide by the cheetah. These are animals that give birth to young that are relatively mature. In other words, at the point where they are born, they can survive outside the mother's body simply by drinking milk. They don't have to be attached to her or anything like that. Now, most mammals fall into that category. So practically all of the mammals that you're familiar with would be falling into the eutherian or placental category, including some animals that I'm not going to talk about very much today, the bats and the whales. Now, there's a second category of mammals which are often called marsupials or pouched mammals. And this is represented in this picture by the kangaroo. In this case, the babies are born alive. In other words, this animal does not lay eggs. But the young are born in a very immature state, so they have to sit in a pouch of the mother where they are carried, and they drink milk within the pouch. And then the third category of mammals, which is here, are almost often called monotremes, and these are the only mammals that lay eggs. And there are only two mammals in the world today alive that fall into this category. This is called the spiny anteater, and this is the other one, an animal called the duckbill platypus. As you can see, the spiny anteater and duckbill platypus are rather different kinds of animals, in the sense that one of them eats ants and lives on land, whereas the duckbill platypus swims around and has this kind of a duck bill, which is where it gets its name. Now, these animals lay eggs. They are the only mammals that lay eggs today. They live in Australia, so you're not going to be finding them in today's world. Now, if you looked outside, say, around Greenfield Community College, the only mammal that you might find that was not a placental mammal or a eutherian would be the opossum. The opossum is a member of the second group, the marsupials or pouched mammals. So actually, in the whole of North America today, the only marsupials are the pouched mammals, and of course there are no monotremes or egg-laying mammals. Now I'm going to say a few things about time, and this may be a little small for you to read, but this time span, which is in yellow, is called the Mesozoic, and it's often called the age of reptiles. And in particular, it's sometimes called the age of dinosaurs, because this is the time period when dinosaurs became the dominant the dominant animals on land. So the Mesozoic is listed here as having three periods within it: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. And those are Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous there. Now, mammals first appear right about at the end of the Triassic and the beginning of the Jurassic. So on this sheet, right about there. But although they had appeared by that time, they didn't do very much. They remained rather small and insignificant because the dinosaurs were such predominant animals at that time, particularly during the daytime on land, so that the mammals never really got a chance to diversify to a very great extent. So mammals existed through the Jurassic and the Cretaceous as relatively small animals. And then, as many of us know, because it's so famous and talked about a lot. At the end of the Cretaceous, which is right there, there was a mass extinction which wiped out virtually all of the dinosaurs. And I say virtually because the birds are now considered to be dinosaurs. But from our point of view, from all practical purposes, we'll say that the dinosaurs became extinct at the end of the Cretaceous at what we call the KT boundary. And then we move into the Cenozoic era, which has also several time periods within it. I've called them the Tertiary and the Pleistocene and the recent. And the Cenozoic, which is in blue here, is typically called the age of mammals. So this is the time period when mammals became extremely diverse, and we see the development of the mammalian faunas that we see today. Now this picture moves us back to the Triassic, which was the time period in which the mammals first appeared and in which dinosaurs were becoming the dominant land animals. And this shows the way that the continents were more or less arranged. And one of the things you'll notice is that the continents were not at all arranged in the same way that they are now. And in fact, they tended to be rather crowded together into a single landmass, which is often called Pangaea. So this whole thing is called Pangaea, and Pangaea has really two parts to it. The northern part, which is often called Laurasia, and the southern part, which is typically called Gondwana land. Now, when the continents were all together like this, it was relatively easy for animals to migrate back and forth among the continents. There might be climatic or terrain things that would cause barriers for migration. But on the whole, animals were able to move, particularly through Gondwana, but also pretty much worldwide. And that's why if you look, say, at dinosaur faunas in the late Triassic or even somewhat later, you find that they are rather uniform throughout the world. So there were not huge major differences of the fauna across the continents. Now, this, of course, you won't be able to read the writing, but this one that you just saw, this represents the Triassic again right here. It shows it a little less congealed as it was in the other picture, but this is supposed to be a picture of the Triassic. This is the Jurassic, this is the end of the Cretaceous, and this is pretty much today. Now, if you look at the end of the Cretaceous, this would be about the time that the dinosaurs became extinct, you'll notice that by that time, a lot of the continents had drifted apart. So although some of them are still attached, for example, North America and Europe are still attached across the very northern part of those continents, there are other continents that are pretty much separated. For example, South America is kind of off on its own, and there's less and less connection, say, of Gondwana. So the continents had started to drift apart. And of course, when you get to the present-day configuration of the continents, you find that there is quite a lot of separation among the continents, that the ability of animals to move back and forth among them is somewhat limited by sea barriers. Now, one of the results of these barriers that developed around the time that mammals were doing most of their diversifying in the Cenozoic, so say at the beginning of the Tertiary and probably even earlier in the Cretaceous, is two things. One, you get the phenomenon of adaptive radiation. Now, that doesn't mean to say that dinosaurs didn't undergo a large adaptive radiation, because they did. But I think mammals perhaps even more from the point of view of the large number of groups that have developed. And second of all, that there's what we call convergence. And convergence is simply that you get different groups of animals converging on similar themes. So you've got an animal here and an animal here, not particularly related to one another at all. Then those animals would develop similar habits, for example, eating ants or running rapidly or eating a certain kind of other food or something like that. So you would see on different continents all over the world the convergent appearance of certain kinds of animals. Now, adaptive radiation and convergence are going to be sort of major themes of what I'm talking about today. So you'll see a lot of examples of it in the slides that I'm going to be showing you. Now, I'm going to sort of go continent by continent and say a few words about the various continents from the point of view of the mammals that have lived there and live there today. And you'll see the theme developed in different ways of adaptive radiation and convergence in different scenes. First of all, we start with Australia. And this picture is to show Australia at two different times. This is Australia's position during the Cretaceous. It's not at the end of the Cretaceous, but during the Cretaceous. Notice that it was way far south of where it is today, and in fact, it was right connected to Antarctica. Now, this does not mean that Australia was so very terribly cold at that time. You would think it would be, being way down in the Antarctic Circle, but the whole Earth in the Cretaceous was a lot warmer than it is today, and there probably weren't any ice caps much of anywhere. So it was a lot farther south, and even Antarctica didn't have ice on it really at that time, or not much. So it was reasonably warm. Now, during the course of the Cenozoic, the continent of Australia has been drifting, and of course this introduces or goes farther on the concept of continental drift, which basically means that the continents are moving around. I won't talk about mechanisms, but you can just say they've been moving around. So it has drifted and rotated to a position today in which the northern part of Australia is not too far south of the equator. So the climate has changed from the point of view that it has become, at least in the northern parts, almost equatorial or tropical, and it is definitely not down around the Antarctic Circle. But you might also notice that during the time of its movement, it was not attached to any other continent. So it became detached from Antarctica and was sort of heading off on its own for a fairly long period of time. And the result is that you have developed a fauna in Australia that is quite unique. And most people know at least a little bit about this fauna because some of the animals are well known and fascinating. This is the duck-billed platypus. I mentioned that the only place in the world that the monitoring group, that egg-laying group that I wrote up there, where they live today, is in Australia. So the spiny anteater and the duck-billed platypus that I just mentioned will live in Australia, and they're both of them endangered species, so they're not particularly numerous, but they do well with the kinds of things they eat in a fairly restricted situation. But of course, one of the main stories of mammals in Australia has to do with the marsupials, because this is the single place on Earth where the marsupials have sort of ruled as far as mammals are concerned. So they have become the dominant land animals in Australia. So a lot of what's gone on in Australia has been the story of the marsupials, or the pouched mammals. Now, what this picture is supposed to show, and it's a little small for you to see, but you can at least see the animals, is that the animals around this inner circle, which is a little bit darker, all of these are Australian marsupials. So you can see there's a tremendous diversity of them. You might say that there had been an adaptive radiation of marsupials in Australia, because from a very small and probably insectivorous or omnivorous ancestor, you have a radiation into a variety of appearances and a variety of diets and so forth. In the outside circle, around here, these are mammals that exist on other continents, and these are all placental mammals out here, to which the various marsupials in Australia are convergent. So if we're talking about convergent, meaning they're similar in either their diet or the way their teeth are, or the way what they do, and so forth. So let me give you some examples. Of course, there is no picture of a dog out here, but this animal looks remarkably like a dog. This is the Tasmanian wolf, which may or may not be extinct, probably is. This animal is rather dog-like and would be a carnivore, somewhat like a dog. These animals in here this is a Tasmanian devil and a variety of little mouse-like forms. These are convergent to various carnivores and so forth, like minks or weasels or civets on other continents. This is a bandicoot or numbat, and it is convergent to an anteater which lives in South America. Actually, that's a numbat. This is a bandicoot there, similar to some sorts of squirrels and things like that. This is a marsupial mole, similar to moles in other continents. And then we get a whole range of herbivores, plant eaters of various sorts, such as the wombat, similar to our local woodchuck. You get koalas, which of course are famous today because of the fact that they eat a very restricted diet of eucalyptus leaves. There are gliding animals called phalangers, which are convergent on, say, flying squirrels. There are animals that are sort of like primates, a little bit like lemurs. And then there are things like kangaroos and so forth, which although they don't look a lot like antelope or deer, are very similar to them in the fact that they can move rapidly across grasslands or browse in the woods. In addition to all of these various kinds of marsupials which are convergent to some of these placental mammals of other continents, there are a few that are extinct today that are not even around as part of the fauna today, but still have to be considered part of the marsupial radiation in Australia. For example, there are some very large browsing kangaroos, not fast hopping or living in trees like various kangaroos and wallabies are today, but rather sort of heavy-bodied, browsing, very short-faced kangaroos. And to take it a little farther, there were also some very large-bodied animals which might remind you almost of elephants or something like that, a whole variety of relatively large-bodied plant-eating marsupials, many of them walking around on four legs, so not two-legged like kangaroos are. And these animals would have been sort of comparable to things like rhinoceroses or some of the more heavy-bodied animals that would be, or elephants in other continents. So our theme then of Australia is mostly marsupials undergoing a vast adaptive radiation, and you see a lot of convergence to animals on other continents. There are hardly any placentals in South America, and the ones that there are got there very late. For example, there are a few mice-like rodents. There are a few bats, and of course there's the dingo, which got there presumably brought by humans. But all of these have been there for a relatively short period of time, and they haven't really affected too strongly the huge marsupial radiation. Now you can compare that situation to what's gone on in South America. Now South America has been isolated too. As you saw in one of those pictures of the Cretaceous, at the Cretaceous, around the time that mammals were starting to diversify, and in the Cenozoic, when they were really flowering in diversity after the dinosaurs had become extinct, South America was pretty much by itself on its own, like Australia. But you're going to see that the situation in South America was somewhat more complicated than in Australia because the mix of animals that were there to begin with was somewhat different. Now actually, there were also marsupials in South America. So probably from somewhere in the Cretaceous, we have some kind of marsupial in South America. And they started out as rather opossum-like animals. And in fact, the opossum is sometimes considered to be a so-called living fossil because it is so much like its ancestors or relatives back, say, as far back as the Cretaceous. So the South American marsupials started out looking a lot like opossums, and this is actually a fossil of an opossum. If you compared it point by point with a living opossum, it would not be too different. Now you would think that with something like the opossum to start out in South America, that you might have gotten a blossoming of marsupials of a whole lot of kinds like you did in Australia, but you didn't. You got a few really interesting ones, and this is an example of a really interesting one right here. This is a marsupial. You wouldn't believe it looking at it because there's no other marsupials like it. This is what you might call a saber-tooth marsupial. It's the genus Thylacosmilus. And it's developed this huge stabbing saber canine, and presumably went around, say, stalking or waiting for other animals that it might kill. This animal is convergent upon, and here's again the term convergent, upon animals that have often been called saber-toothed cats that lived in the northern continent. So for example, this saber-toothed cat, which also has a saber, is a true cat. It's really related to things like lions and so forth, pretty close. Now this saber-toothed cat is best known from a place called Rancho La Brea, which is a tar pit in the Los Angeles area, where they came to feast on animals that got stuck in the tar pits. So it's we know quite a lot about the saber-toothed cat. Now, in details of the skull and the body, the saber-toothed cat is quite different from the animal we just saw, Thylacosmilus, the marsupial saber-tooth. But they are a good case of convergence of morphology of these two animals. Now, most of the marsupials in South America became carnivores, or stayed omnivores or insectivores maybe. So there was not a radiation into as many niches, shall we say, or as many ways of doing things. So, for example, there were no major, say, ant-eating marsupials or plant-eating marsupials or anything like that. The marsupials didn't go in that direction. And the reason for that seems to be that instead in South America there were some other animals that were doing those things instead. These animals were placentals. So you did have some placentals in South America, eutherian mammals, and these were filling some of the niches, and presumably the marsupials were not able to radiate into those niches. But the eutherians or placentals that were there were doing fascinating things on their own, and I'm going to give you some examples of them and show you some pictures of them. For example, you have the armadillo group, and armadillos eventually got into North America, so if you've been to Florida or Texas, you may have actually seen one. Now, some of the armadillo group became very large and tank-like. This is an animal called the glyptodont, and basically it was a tank-like herbivorous edentate relative of the armadillo. There were also the sloths, which are also considered to be edentates within this group. We know today of the tree sloths, which live in some of the rainforests of places like the Amazon basin. But in the fossil record, in addition to these tree sloths, there are relatives of the tree sloths which became huge. These are called ground sloths, and partly we call them ground sloths because nobody can really imagine these guys being up in the trees. Some of them were as big as elephants. So they were presumably browsing around in various areas, feeding on leaves and things like that. The other group of edentates are the anteaters. So here is an anteater here. Notice the very thin snout and these animals will sort of put their heads into the nests of ants and things like that, and then they use their sticky tongues to pull the ants out. I've got a picture later of another anteater that shows the tongue even better than this one does. So you have then the group of edentates, including the armadillos and their relatives, the sloths, including the tree sloths and the ground sloths, and then you have the anteaters. So these were one contingent of eutherian mammals or placentals that were doing interesting things in South America, along with the more carnivorous or omnivorous marsupials. We also have in South America an array of really strange, what we call ungulates. Now, ungulate is a very sloppy term in many ways, but it simply is often used to talk about a group of herbivorous mammals that tend to walk more or less on their toes. They have hoofs very often, though not always. And examples of ungulates that live on other continents would be things like elephants, horses, deer. Those are all would be considered ungulates, but of different groups. Now, in South America, there were an array of very bizarre ungulates, none of which have survived today. So they're completely gone. So we only know about them through the fossil record. Some of them had kind of weird proboscis, like this one. Otherwise, this animal might have been considered like a camel. There were some that were sort of rhinoceros-like, so they were big, heavy-bodied creatures. So again, we're seeing convergence because we're seeing animals that are rather similar in what they eat or their body form or something like that to those on other continents. We have, this is a very famous one from South America. It's an animal called a Leptoptern, and the name doesn't matter. But in the Leptoptern group, some of the animals were running fast, and they developed adaptations for running fast, among which were the loss of toes. So here's an animal which has only one toe. And of course, you may think of another animal that exists today that has only one toe, the horse. So these animals were like horses in the sense that they were running animals. They had developed only one toe, but yet they did it several million years earlier than horses did on the northern continent. So this is another really well-known case of convergence of a South American group to another one. There was also a South American group which developed elephant-like heads. This is the skull. Actually, the skull of this animal exists at Amherst College. It's not on display, but it's a very famous skull, which was collected from the southern part of South America. And the reconstruction of this animal shows it with a proboscis and tusk-like things, and it was probably rather elephant-like in the way it did things. So what then we see in South America is, again, an adaptive radiation, but the players are somewhat different. The cast of characters is different. We do have the marsupials, of course, but we also have the placental animals such as the edentates and the various ungulate groups which underwent radiations convergent to those seen in other continents. Now, there's another way in which the South American situation becomes complicated, and that's because there are immigrants into South America that did not occur, say, into Australia. For example, at some point, and we don't know exactly how it happened, it may have been by rafting, in other words, a big clump of vegetation, perhaps during a flood season, detaching off of Africa and rafting over to South America, because we have the appearance in South America of two groups that hadn't been there before, sometime in the middle part of the Cenozoic, in the Tertiary. These animals are the South American rodents, which gave rise to such animals as the chinchilla, the capybara, and our porcupine, and also primates, certain monkeys, which became the monkeys of the Amazon basin, things like the marmosets and so forth. So there were additions to the South American fauna. And then later on, there were even more additions. And I know you can't see all of this, but another thing that happened to South America is right about at the beginning of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, so at the end of the Tertiary and the beginning of the Pleistocene, suddenly South America became attached to North America. And if you think of those continents the way they are today, you'll know what did it, the Isthmus of Panama. So you had a land attachment which developed between the northern part of South America and the southern part of North America, so that the two continents all of a sudden were able to exchange their faunas. That's how things like the armadillo got into North America, and quite a number of things got into South America. So you have a whole lot of things like shrews, rabbits, squirrels, dogs, bears, raccoons, weasels, cats, which gave rise to things like jaguars, deer, camels, peccaries, tapirs, horses, and mastodons that got into South America. So a whole lot of things got into South America relatively late in time, say right in the Pleistocene for the most part. And they changed the fauna and the look of the fauna of South America a lot, so that instead of having some of those bizarre ungulates that I was just telling you about, those all went extinct. So instead in South America we have things like deer, camels, peccaries, and tapirs. I'll have a few more things to say about horses and mastodons, because those became extinct in South America before today. Okay, so that's the South American story. Now I can go on and say a few things about Africa. I'm not going to say a lot. Africa would be considered to be somewhat isolated, particularly in the early part of the Cenozoic. So right after the end of the Mesozoic, during the earlier part of the Cenozoic, it was fairly isolated. But it got less and less isolated as time went on, and there was actually a fair amount of connection between it and, say, Eurasia, so that a lot of the animals that lived there were going back and forth. So it's sometimes hard to figure out exactly which things originated in Asia and which things might have originated in Africa. Now, there are a few groups, though, that are thought of in connection with Africa. One is the elephant group, which seems to have undergone a great deal of its history in Africa. Some of them did get away from Africa, so that you find them in places like Eurasia, in even North America, and eventually even South America after the Isthmus of Panama closed up. So they got around, but Africa seems to be the center of where they did most of their evolution. Another group of Africa is called the Hyraxes. This is an animal that is mentioned in the Bible, but it's not an animal that most of us are familiar with. They're kind of small, rabbit-like animals that live on either rock piles or in trees. This is another animal you're probably not familiar with, but is typically African. It's called the elephant shrew. It's a little hopping animal, and the reason it's called an elephant shrew is because it has kind of a, almost like a little trunk on its nose. And then the primates are also considered to be a group that has had a lot of its history go on in Africa, particularly the lineages that gave rise to the old, so-called Old World monkeys, the apes, and ultimately humans. Now, I'm showing you North America, but I'm doing it sort of to introduce you to the fact that the northern continents were nowhere near as isolated as continents like Australia or South America, and for various reasons. Now, early, say back in the early part of the Cenozoic, this part of North America was actually connected to Europe, but that broke down. Later on, North America was sort of intermittently connected to Asia by a bridge from Alaska to Siberia, the so-called Bering Land Bridge. And of course today there's it's not very far across from Alaska to Siberia, And so at times, say, of low ocean levels and things like that, it would be pretty reasonable for any animal that it could get up to this latitude to cross over between the two places. And of course, I mentioned that late in the Tertiary and the beginning of the Pleistocene, you had the Isthmus of Panama, which connected North America to South America. So North America has not been a particularly isolated place. But yet, there are some animals that have undergone their evolution specifically there. Now, this is an animal that can get around very easily. In fact, carnivores in general, a lot of them have fairly big ranges of movement so that they can cover a fair amount of distance. And things like wolves and some of the large cats and things like that, if they're capable of living in the climates where some of the land bridges were, say, to Asia or back from Asia, they would cross. So an animal like the wolf today has a distribution that really covers all of the northern continents. So you can find wolves in North America, you can find wolves in Asia, you can find them in Europe. So they've tended to get around a lot. And there are animals like them, carnivores, many of them, but some of them not, which have really been able to go back and forth rather easily whenever the opportunity existed. Now, you may not know that there are some animals which really today are associated with Eurasia or Africa that really evolved mostly in North America. And a very classic case of this would be the horses. Now today you think of horses as being, think of for example, the chariot racers in Rome. So that would be Europe. Or think of the Mongolian horsemen who used the horse for all kinds of things and became incredibly wonderful riders. So that would be Asia. So one place that horses, and this is the Przewalski horse, which is one of the sort of native Asian horses. And also, in Africa, we have a horse, the zebra, which is sort of native to Africa, and we think of it really only in connection with that continent. So when we think of horses today, we think of the horses, the donkeys, the asses, the zebras, all of which are from the Old World. We don't tend to necessarily think of horses being American. But yet, most of the evolution of the horse actually happened in North America. Now, you won't be able to read this very well, but this middle part represents North America. So all of this area right in here is North America. This is South America on the left, and as you can see, horses very late in their history got a little bit into South America. In the Old World in this case would mean Eurasia and Africa, you see occasional horses. So you see a group of horses here, you see another one here, here, and here, and then actually the horses that you see in Eurasia and Africa today are actually descendants of horses that came over from North America in the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age, when the sea levels were low. So these horses got over into the Old World relatively late. So the evolution of horses is really a North American story. So when you think about horse evolution, this is one of the first three-toed horses, North American. This is one of the first grazing horses, able to eat grass rather than browse in trees because of its hard teeth. This is also North American. This is the first one-toed horse, Pliohippus, also North American. So there are, in fact, horses are one of the most numerous fossils you'll find if you go looking out in places like the western part of North America where fossils are common. Now, one of the funny events about horses, and again, you may be fascinated by this particular thing, is if you look at the very top of this diagram, right along there, you'll find that at the very top of it, horses disappear, both in North America and also in South America. So there was a major extinction that happened of horses in North America and South America. We don't know what caused it. There's been a lot of speculation whether it might have been human-related, whether it might have been caused by a disease. We really don't know what was the reason for it. But in any case, they disappeared from the Americas altogether. So the only reason that we have horses in North America right now is that Europeans brought them when they, in 1492 and later. So the Spanish brought them. The Native Americans were very quick to adopt the horse as a major way of getting around and doing all kinds of things. But horses were not there during the pre-European part of North American history, or South American history for that matter. Now there's another American group of animals. There are actually several, but this is another one of the famous ones, the camels. Camels also underwent most of their evolution in North America, but like the horses, they went extinct around 10,000 years ago, and they are only existing in other places because they migrated out. So we think of camels as being, say, desert animals in, say, Asia and Africa. This is because camels got there during the Ice Age and did very well. Another kind of camel that lives on another continent are the llamas and the alpacas and things like that in South America. These also do very well in mountainous, dry areas. But notice that they are surviving and doing well on other continents, that they went extinct in North America despite the fact that their evolutionary history is mostly in North America. Now this is supposed to remind me to bring things together. And I've actually, this is where I stopped talking about the continents. And you've seen already a number of cases of adaptive radiations of groups, whether it be horses or whether it be marsupials in Australia or whatever. And we've seen cases of convergence, such as the saber-toothed marsupial or the horse-like ungulate that lived in South America that isn't related to the horse at all. But I thought I would just show you one case of convergence where I can just sort of list down all of the animals that are convergent, say, or most of them, for a particular kind of way of doing things. And this is going to be ant-eating. In other words, that you eat ants or insects primarily, and that means that you sort of have to have a special way of getting into the nest and getting the insects out. In Australia, you have the spiny anteater, which is, as you can see, long-snouted and has no teeth and is a very good anteater. There are also some marsupial anteaters in South America, such as the numbat. In South America, you have the anteaters that are members of the edentate group, and I said I would show you another one. This is the giant anteater. Notice the really long head and the incredibly long sticky tongue that this animal, so it can stick its nose into a burrow of insects and stick out the sticky tongue and then pull the insects in. In Africa and Asia, you have an animal called the scaly anteater, also called a pangolin. And you can see the scales on it like this. This animal, as you can see, also has a long snout and can live on the ground or in trees and will feed primarily on insects. In Africa today, you have an animal called the aardvark. Now, I promised I'd say a little something about aardvarks, since I've said something about zebras already. Aardvarks would certainly fall into the ant-eating category too, and as you can see, the long snout, they can dig. They have very sharp claws on their toes, and they can dig into nests and put their snout in and feed on insects. And lastly, you may not think of this animal as an anteater. It's a kind of a hyena. It's called the aardwolf. And the beginning of it is just like the Ard of aardvark. Aardvark sort of means the ant pig. This is the ant wolf. These are actually insectivores, despite the fact that they're hyenas. They have very simple teeth. They have not gone very far in terms of changing their morphology. If you looked at them perhaps maybe 20 million years down the pike, you might find that these were looking a little bit more like those long-snouted animals that I just showed you. So this is one group then of convergent animals on anteating, and you find different ones on different continents. Now, if the continents had not split apart, maybe you would have just one anteater found on all of the continents. So I think that continental drift has been encouraging the amount of diversification that mammals have undergone. Finally, as a very last point, I thought I'd just mention to you an interesting work of science fiction. This was written, it's a book that was written by a fellow named Dougal Dixon, and it was called After Man, A Biology of the Future. And it was supposed to figure out, well, what would the Earth be like 50 million years from now? And that's why I say it's science fiction, because obviously it's speculative. But it's based on the kind of animals that are around today, the knowledge of continental drift, so where the continents may be, and also basic principles of evolution, principles of mammals and what are around. Okay, now if you look at the world in the future, I'll just mention a few interesting points. Los Angeles will have gone right by San Francisco with the San Andreas Fault moving north. Australia will have bumped into Asia, and there'll be a big mountain range building up right about there. And the eastern part of Africa, right here, will have been rifting off sort of on its own. So you'll have some things, for example, Australia will be much more connected with Asia than it is now. But on the other hand, some parts of Africa will be a little bit more separated. So things will have changed. Now, Dougal Dixon then speculated, well, what kinds of animals are numerous now? What might we expect in the future? So he drew some pictures, and he's a very clever artist. This is supposed to be a rabbit. And of course, rabbits, we know, are very successful. And so he calls this animal a rabbuck, which would be a fast-running rabbit. And it's being chased by a survivor, a descendant of the rat, which also he has as a sort of a carnivorous animal. Also numerous in the world today are the antelopes, particularly in Africa, but they're a very successful and diverse group. He sees the antelopes as developing into a variety of different forms. These would be called the hornheads, and what they might have developed into in certain regions of the world. And he also sees things like the hippopotamuses as being, they've become amphibious in the sense that they can live both on water and on land. He sees them as sort of completing the transition to mostly living in the water, developing more fin-like limbs to do that. So you can take some of this information that we've been talking about. Obviously, Dixon's work, we won't be around to see whether any of it comes to pass, but it makes for fun speculation. And I think this is a good time to end, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.